Greetings. My name's Dauncey, and this is the show Change the World, where, as you know, if you're a regular viewer, I like to invite people on who are passionate about life, who are working hard for a vision to change things for the better, done with the moaning and groaning, right? My privilege today is to have Doug White III as my guest, and your native Indian name is Councillor, right? And I discovered from you just now, that means the Milky Way, right? You're named after stardust, which is very cool. And your current big role is you're director of the Center for Pre-Confederation, Treaties and Reconciliation at Vancouver Island University. So we'll get into that stuff soon. It's a whole lot of stuff I want to learn from you. But your family background fascinates me, because I know there's more continuity in First Nations family than there is, say, in my family. Your grandfather, Doug White I, was a salmon and herring fisherman, logger, faller, great lacrosse player, soccer player, and chief of the Snuneymuxw First Nation for quite a while. Your mother is Ellen White, a very esteemed elder. Right?
Grandmother, yeah.
Tell me, your grandmother, right?
Yeah.
Your father, Doug White II, long-term member of council again, Native Sons Lacrosse Club, Nanaimo Hall of Fame lacrosse, football and soccer, right?
Yes.
And also an elected chief. He was on council too, I think, right?
He's been an acting chief, but he's been a councillor for, I think, about 3 decades now.
So now you've been both a council and a chief yourself.
Yes.
So what's it like sitting on that wonderful heritage from your grandfather, your father, and I'm probably great-great-grandfather before that? What's it feel like?
Yeah, it's a remarkable family. I feel blessed to have been born into this family. I was always raised to sort of have my mind turned toward trying to make sure that I was focused on looking after my people and protecting them and doing the best that I could to improve their situation.
Yeah. And your people, we should say, the Snuneymuxw First Nation.
Yeah, the Snuneymuxw First Nation here in Nanaimo.
Nanaimo, right?
Yes.
So Nanaimo is a corruption of Snuneymuxw.
That's right. Yeah.
But go back to your family.
Yeah, well, my grandfather, he was like a father to me. I grew up going out fishing with him on a regular basis, and he really looked after me, him and my grandmother, Ellen. My grandmother, Ellen's 95 now.
Whoa. Yeah.
And they both have really remarkable histories and stories.
Yeah.
My grandfather, he grew up in the 1920s and 30s. And when he was I think he was 12 years old when he got up and went to go and work.
Right.
He packed up his belongings and headed out the front door, and I remember him telling me the story. He said his mother was calling down to him, son, what are you doing? Where are you going? And he said, I'm going to work, Mom. And he got on a boat, and he went up to Rivers Inlet, to Awikino, to go and work in the canneries up there, fishing.
Did he avoid getting put into the residential school system?
In part because of that, but yeah. And then my grandmother, for her part, she has another remarkable story. She was born in the American side of the border. The Coast Salish world is split in half by the international border.
Right.
And so there was a lot of fluidity and going back and forth.
A lot of canoeing.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. And our people would go down and pick berries and work in the fields and whatnot on the American side of the border and go and visit family.
The Olympic Peninsula coast and around the corner down to...
Not the Olympic Peninsula coast, but down, like all around the Salish Sea.
Oh,
so down to
Bellingham
Tacoma,
kind of
Seattle.
Oh, right, down to Seattle.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And her
Puyallup,
story was...
other parts of Washington. So when she was little and she came back, she was in Canada, because the family owned an island off the coast of Kuper Island. It's called Norway Island now, but it used to be called Rice Island.
Right.
So she comes from the Rice family, from the Penalicut people.
Okay.
So the reserve is Kuper Island, where there was a residential school.
Yes.
When she was a little girl, she tells this story of hanging on the windowsill of the residential school, looking in longingly, wondering why she couldn't be in school with other parts of her family.
Yes.
And she couldn't be in school because she was not considered a Canadian Indian at the time. And so because of that weird happenstance of the international border, she was spared from the residential school.
Wow.
And her grandmother at the time said to them, and a number of other little kids from her family, her cousins, said to them that all of these kids were in the same position. If you can't go to their school, you're going to go to my school. And she was a traditional healer and had knowledge of medicinal, all of the teachings, all of the remarkable teachings of our people that were then passed on to that generation of kids.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of a happenstances of international borders and history that protected my grandmother from the school.
So I remember talking to Geraldine Manson, and she said that when she turned 16 or so, and there was family things going on, her elders claimed her and said, "You're now going to come and learn with us."
Yeah.
And they taught her the old ways, the old traditions, which now allows her to be an elder, right?
That's right. And then my mother, for her part, when she was young, she was in the Alberni residential school.
Right.
And in this country, we've just been through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process.
Yes.
That was a major national endeavor to try to understand what was all that history about, what was happening.
Yes.
To raise public awareness of that reality and what happened here in this country. And to figure out how do we now together reimagine a different kind of relationship between Indigenous peoples and others. And it's a very painful process. Everyone needs to understand that that was a gesture of utmost good faith on the part of all of those survivors.
Yes.
To engage in the TRC process, to share their stories.
And share their real vulnerabilities.
To really open up and talk about things that people generally did not talk about in the community at all. The whole thing came about because of litigation here in Nanaimo. There was a number of students that had gone to the Alberni residential school that had been abused by Arthur Plint.
Yes.
And so they raised, for the first time, they sought a criminal process to have him held accountable for what had happened to them.
Yes.
And that really, for the first time in Canadian history, opened up an issue that most Canadians didn't really know about and didn't understand what had happened. And so that led to other litigation across the country, class actions that ultimately were settled through the Indian residential school settlement between Canada, the churches, and Aboriginal and the survivors that led to the TRC process. So one of the things I learned about all of this through the TRC was that when my mother was at the residential school with all of her cousins and everybody else, they were actually subjected to medical experimentation of starvation. There was a
deliberate.
They were like, we want to know how hunger and starvation affects people. And so, and one of the only things my mother ever really talked about when we were growing up about her residential school experience was the hunger. And she talked about there was sort of an underground black market of scraps of food like orange peels and whatnot that were stolen from the garbage of the kitchen became like a commodity of trading of kids, keeping themselves alive and nutrition. And the other story was about the deep sense of isolation from family, because she was there with her brother, my late Uncle Robert Thomas, who was a chief of Snuneymuxw as well. Yes. And they were not allowed to acknowledge their relationship to each other as brother and sister.
What? Even as
so the whole idea being that you take all of these kids away out of communities and put them in school
and
to
community
isolate them,
tight, dense community,
and like isolate them from previous generations, from their parents and from their grandparents. But even in the context of the school itself, they were not even allowed to acknowledge. She told me that they would steal acknowledgement once in a while. Like across a field,
or a little look or something.
like a hidden wave, and that was the way of maintaining a sense of who you are as an individual. That in this world, I am the sister of Robert Thomas, and that's him right over there. Yes. And because it was a very, very troubling stuff to find out. And I got to tell you, it did not get me in the mood for reconciliation at all. When you learn those things about what your mother's been subjected to and how she was treated. So her family, they effectively moved to the United States to avoid residential school.
Yes.
So she grew up from when she was about 10 or so in Seattle, and then moved back to Nanaimo later on after she graduated. So anyways, and then my father grew up here in Nanaimo, and he was part of the very first crew of Snuneymuxw that were allowed into the public school. So he went to Princess Royal Elementary.
Right.
And
this is what, the 1970s?
This
60s?
would have been, I guess that would have been the 1950s.
50s, okay.
Yeah. So there was for whatever reason, that was available and open, and he went. And it was not the greatest welcome that he ever received. He tells a remarkable story of the end of the first day. He came out the front door, and he said there was a group of guys standing there.
Yeah.
And he thought, oh, I guess they want to play soccer or something. Yeah. And he said, hey, what are you guys up to? And they said, oh, we're here to beat you up. And
welcome to school.
Yeah, welcome to public school. So he said, look, it's not fair if you guys all gang up on me, so I'll fight you.
I'll come back with 20 guys.
No, what he said is, I will fight you, but I'll fight you one by one. So he said he fought them all one by one. And then they became good friends all through their lives. You know, they played football together, soccer together, and all of that. But it was a difficult experience for him in that respect, but ultimately a good experience. And so it's an incredible story, right? The family, how it's dealing with all of the different dimensions and pathways of.
He had the inner strength, confronted with a gang of 20 kids.
Yeah,
so
it was,
to stand his ground.
It was like 5 or 6 kids or something.
It's like, okay, 5 or 6, but to stand his ground, it's straight out of a movie, really.
Oh yeah, no, it's a remarkable story. And he said like polite little Canadian kids, they all lined up and said, okay, well, yeah, we'll fight you one by one. And he, fought them one by one, and that was it.
I was sent to boarding school as well, residential school, but we were at least allowed to go home in the holidays. Yeah. I was able to write home once a week, but I was very timid.
Right.
So I never got to punch anyone. So as a result, I got bullied and never resolved it, right?
Yeah. So the TRC, I mean, one of the interesting things that it talks about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in its calls to action, one of the things it talks about is because I'm the director of the Center for Pre-Confederation Treaties and Reconciliation at Vancouver University, what it says is it says there is a very serious responsibility on the part of the education system in this country to play a very significant role in reconciliation, because they say much of the problem in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canadian society rests at the feet of the education system, both for the residential school system for sure, but also for the current system, both for what it has taught Canadians and what it has not taught Canadians about these important parts of history and about Indigenous peoples.
Absences, though.
Yeah, and they said so there's a lot of responsibility on the part of the education system for the mess of these issues. And there's sort of a redemptive imperative for the education system to play its part, because they said, we know that the education system was used as a weapon against Indigenous peoples, and it allowed itself to be used in that way. And what we ask now and direct now, and we acknowledge and identify that there's an imperative now, is for the education system to be that powerful tool for repairing
So I hear
Canada.
I hear great things about what Vancouver Island University is doing. What about the high schools in the Nanaimo area? Are they picking up the slack to do what's needed?
I'm not too familiar with exactly what's going on in the high schools. I think that they're doing their best. There's been we've had Snuneymuxw has not had a great relationship with the school district. Recently, when I was chief, I had to sue the school district because for whatever reason, they believed that it was appropriate for them to make a decision to close 3 of the 5 schools that Snuneymuxw kids primarily go to without even talking to Snuneymuxw. And I believe that offended the proper need to engage with the Snuneymuxw government and have a discussion about that. So that was pretty messy. That board was almost entirely voted out, and a new board came in, and we've been doing important work with them to repair that negative pattern of disrespect. And in general here in Nanaimo, if I can talk about sort of local Nanaimo reconciliation issues, there's always there's a tension and a challenge between shifting from a relationship that's premised, first, I mean, let's not forget the fact that for the most part, Snuneymuxw has been totally ignored over the past 100 years and longer. Notwithstanding that we have a treaty from 1854, that we went to the Supreme Court of Canada when my grandfather was chief, his cousin Clifford White and David Bob from Snuneymuxw, they went hunting, were charged for hunting deer out of season under the Provincial Game Act. We fought that case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada in the 1960s. It was the first major case in the modern era of Canadian law about Aboriginal issues. And so the subject matter, like the argument, what we had to argue about was the Crown saying there is no such thing as a treaty between the Snuneymuxw and the Crown. That never happened. They entirely denied the reality.
So meanwhile, the white guys are out hunting all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's hunting, right? But I mean, under the Game Act. But this was hunting like in July, 55 years ago this summer. And so what's different about it is that so the story that I'm trying to tell you is that the Snuneymuxw were put in a position where we had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to argue about the most basic elements of history. Did a treaty happen in Nanaimo in 1854 or not? And so did a treaty happen? And if it did happen, is it still valid? And the answer we got in 1965 from the Supreme Court was there is a treaty and it will be recognized. It was entered into in December 23rd, 1854,
Yes.
and it recognizes that the Snuneymuxw can hunt as formerly in accordance with their own laws and traditions.
So what shocks me is that, that they didn't recognize or acknowledge the treaty it had even taken place.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, we're right now we're in an era of fake news and alternative facts and all of these things. Well,
Yes.
hey, you know, this has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
There's this complete denial of basic elements of reality and history.
Yes.
So deep was the denial over more than a century of that treaty relationship on the part of the Crown that by the 1960s, you get a judge or like a magistrate in a courtroom in Nanaimo saying to Clifford White and David Bobb, why are you bringing these ridiculous arguments into my courtroom? He expressed judicial frustration. He said, everybody knows there was never a treaty made in this part of the world. And so, remarkable history.
Wow.
And so we went from really deep denial to getting a Supreme Court of Canada decision and then working over decades to try and have those rights respected and recognized.
So
the moment that, go ahead.
For the judicial system not to know, all I can assume is highly convenient for them to have forgotten.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all about what is part of the official narrative of this country.
Yes.
What is at the heart of the Canadian imagination?
Yes.
What are the official stories and narratives of Canada?
Yeah.
And at that time, it did not include Aboriginal peoples in this part of the world having a treaty relationship. So that all became, over the course of a century, totally denied.
So do you celebrate December 23rd each year as a key milestone for that?
No, we don't, not really. I mean, what we celebrate is who we are as a people. In other parts of the country, in the prairie, in the number of treaties, they really do put a lot of emphasis on the treaty itself, the treaty relationship. For us, the treaty is very important, but what's more important is our inherent foundation and rights as a sovereign people to have authority and jurisdiction and to be able to make decisions and to have the proper relationship with our territory. And all of that is structured with respect to the Crown through a treaty relationship. So first and foremost, what's most important and celebrated are those basic facts about who we are as Indigenous peoples.
Yes. Were they properly reflected in the 1854 treaty?
No, I mean, not entirely, right? I mean, this is like 1854.
Yes.
I mean, what was going on was you have a fledgling government in Victoria that James Douglas is the head of.
Yes.
Who's desperate for an economic foundation for his colony.
Yes, otherwise it's gold rush and Americans taken over.
And so in the southern part of the island, they wanted to settle there and live there, so they entered into treaties with the Indigenous peoples down there between 1850 and 1852.
The Songhees and the
Esquimalt and the Saanich Peninsula. But here in the Nanaimo, it was about resources. It was about, I think there might be an economic foundation here in coal.
Right.
And they knew that for the Crown to be able to access those resources, it was not even a controversial issue. They knew that we cannot access those resources until we have a proper relationship with the Indigenous peoples. Right. And that's what the negotiations were about over the course of a year and longer of negotiations. We came to an understanding with James Douglas and the Hudson's Bay Company that we could make available and sell to them the coal from this part of the world if they had an interest in that. Right. And for their part, they said, look, we will come and do that. We're not going to interfere with your way of life. Yes. You'll be able to carry on, you know, as if we were not here, and all of those different things. So there's the oral tradition and the oral negotiation, the actual negotiation. Then there's the text of the treaty, which is different from the oral understandings.
So let me cut in again there. Clearly, the white community is not good at remembering oral things. But your elders remembered the oral parts of it and passed that down?
Yeah, there's an oral tradition about all of that.
Yeah, because in the white legal tradition, there's no oral tradition at all. It's just all what's written and the judgments.
Right,
and
I mean, there's a focus on the written as opposed to the oral, but
Was there anything in the oral memory that didn't get reflected in the written?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, let me tell you the story about the text, the origin of the text of the Douglas Treaty.
Yes.
In 1850, when Douglas negotiated the treaty with the Victoria area Indigenous peoples, he did that over the course of a few days and sat there and talked with them and came to an understanding about a range of issues.
With interpreters?
Yeah, they were speaking trade language, Chinook, and there were interpreters and whatnot. But it was not. I mean, I can't imagine it was a very high-level communication. Yes. Nonetheless, the negotiation took place. They came to an understanding and an agreement, and they got to their treaty. Then what did Douglas do? Douglas then went and wrote to the Hudson's Bay Company in London,
Yes.
and he said, I've negotiated a treaty with the Victoria Area First Nations.
Yes.
Now I need a text for the treaty. So he writes this letter to Archibald Barclay in London,
Yes.
puts it on a ship. It takes 3 months to get to London. Archibald Barclay gets the letter, reads it, and he goes, well, I'm going to go and talk to, what do I do with this? How do I respond to this? I'm going to go to my friend at the New Zealand Company, who was an entirely different situation.
Yeah. Yes.
The New Zealand Company was not in the shoes of the Crown in the way that the Hudson's Bay Company was with respect to Vancouver Island.
Yes.
It was a proprietary colony.
Yes.
And the Hudson's Bay Company entered into an agreement,
Yeah.
a charter that they received from the Crown that
So-
said, you are going to do the work of the Crown on Vancouver Island to
Right.
settle and colonize Vancouver Island. The New Zealand Company, for their part, they were just a marauding band of land prospectors running around New Zealand trying to gather up rights so that they could get themselves in a position to try and negotiate with the Crown. So they took, the New Zealand Company fellow gave to Archibald Barclay a copy of what's called the Kemp's Deed, which was a purchase agreement that the New Zealand Company entered into
Yes.
with the Naitahu people
Yes.
in New Zealand, gave it to Archibald Barclay. Archibald Barclay basically took the...
So he's a civil servant in London, right?
Archibald Barclay, these are not civil servants.
Okay.
These are company people.
Oh.
These are like private enterprise, New
Right,
Zealand companies,
okay.
just a business set up
Yes.
by private individuals. He shared that document with Archibald Barclay of the Hudson's Bay Company, who
Yes.
did have he was sort of a quasi-governmental official
Yes.
because of their position on Vancouver Island. He puts it on the ship, it comes to Vancouver Island,
Yes.
and almost word for word, the Douglas Treaty text is the purchase agreement between the New Zealand Company and the Naitahu people from New Zealand.
So now, in a rational...
With localizations
Okay,
for the
so
Vancouver Island
we're in
context.
my rational
So
hat.
when you say, well, how different is the negotiated treaty that took place, like we're sitting
Right.
down here and talking right now, versus the text, they're
So
quite different.
Wearing my rational hat, I would assume
Yeah.
they bring the treaty back to you, check the wording, and then you'd sign off on it. But that didn't happen, right?
No, it didn't. No, it's a very unique, unusual history.
Wow.
So there's elements of the written text that do line up with the oral history. There's the recognition that at least the limited part of the land, the Crown
Yes.
recognizes the Aboriginal title
Yes.
of the Snuneymuxw to our village sites and the lands that we depend upon.
Yes.
And then there's the recognition of hunting and fishing to carry on as formerly.
But even then, I gather one of those village sites was later taken away.
Yeah, none of the village sites were properly respected for the most part. By the first moment of advocacy by Snuneymuxw chiefs was about a decade later in 1863. There's a record of Snuneymuxw chiefs talking to then Governor Kennedy
Yes.
of BC to say, what is going on here? Like, we have a treaty. Why are you not living up to the terms of the treaty?
Yeah.
So less than a decade passed and there was already fundamental treaty breaches, primarily about Departure Bay and downtown Nanaimo,
Yes.
where our people were already being pushed out of those major village sites. Those are the two main winter village sites of the
Right.
Snuneymuxw.
So right in downtown Nanaimo, there was a village site.
And so when the Snuneymuxw people think of home, their hearts and their minds turn towards Departure Bay and downtown Nanaimo, because that's
So on that
the main winter village sites where all of the major ceremonies would
So
take
where the
place.
ferry is literally, or on the slope looking down towards the ferry?
On Departure Bay?
Yes.
It's the whole, it's that whole region.
The whole bay with the
You know
ferry
where,
at one end.
like where the public park is
Yes,
and all
yes,
of the lands
all
behind
around.
it, all up to, up to the
Neck
Lindley,
Point.
up in Lindley Valley
Yes.
and over
Oh,
to
wow.
Neck Point and that whole region
Wow.
is the main winter village site of the Snuneymuxw. And then in downtown Nanaimo, Hwasalachwa is the name of the village site there. It's all sort of like the harbor of Nanaimo, the whole region. And so anyways, being pushed out and that not being properly recognized. So there's a very, I want to sort of shift our
Yes.
discussion to the more contemporary
We've got about 4 minutes left.
era.
That's how time flies.
because so there's lots of patterns of denial, and so when lots of work like starting to use the courts and legal process to make change through the White and Bob litigation, and that opened up 50 years of litigation on the parts of Aboriginal peoples
Yes.
about Aboriginal title and about treaty rights and about Aboriginal rights, all of these things. So there's been, in the Constitution in 1982, recognized and affirmed those treaty and Aboriginal rights.
Right.
So tremendous progress has been made in certain sort of on paper. When I became the chief of Snuneymuxw in 2009, 2010, and sat down, and from that perspective, and understood the great work that generations earlier had done to create a treaty, to demand a treaty relationship from the 1850s, and in the 1960s to demand recognition of that, going all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. You would think deep into the 21st century that things would be quite different.
You'd hope so.
When I showed up as chief, I've got to tell you, the overwhelming feeling was one of that Snuneymuxw was being completely ignored and disrespected. That we had all kinds of little relationship agreements on the wall, but there was no substance to them.
Is that by the provincial government and the federal government?
Provincial government, federal government, local government, the Port Authority. It was ridiculous. So we did a lot of really hard work to start to shift that basic pattern. Premised on implementation of our treaty from 1854 and using that as a tool. And so we've made significant progress. So we got to a reconciliation agreement with BC in 2013, which quadrupled the land base of Snuneymuxw and provided resources up in the mountains. And so we're working hard now in negotiations with both BC and Canada. When I was chief, we had the Harper regime and the tail end of the Campbell and the Clark government in BC. So it was difficult, but we still made progress, but it was not, it was sort of transactional progress. Now, what's important about the moment that we're in is that we have a federal government that says that they are going to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They are going to review all federal law and policy to ensure that there is alignment between that law and policy with the United Nations Declaration and with the Section 35 jurisprudence. Now, we also have now a provincial government that is saying the same things. So there's this unique alignment. The stars have aligned in a way that creates a really important defining moment.
And I want to end with that sentence. Our time is up. So the stars are aligning. It's a totally important moment. We need to seize the time. On my mother's side, I got Scottish ancestry. So I'm sure some of my grand cousins came and did to your people. And I can't apologize to them, for them, but I can thank you for all the leadership that you're giving now for your people and for all of us in the process of reconciliation, that we can move together as one joint shared custodians and stewards of this beautiful island and this beautiful country, and honor the past and understand the past. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. So yes, time's up. My name's Guy Dauncey. This has been the show Change the World. Time just flies when you're having fun like this. There's so much to learn, I tell you, right? One of my small contributions to the future, which is a novel I wrote called Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible, which includes some stuff for First Nations, hopes and futures, which basically premises that we can live in a much better way if we just set our minds and our hearts and our souls to it. If you enjoy this kind of programming, tune in next week for more, and thanks for watching.